To function, skin color stratification requires both racism and colorism. I use the term racism to refer to the United States system of prejudice, discrimination, and institutional power that privileges whites and oppresses various people of color, including African Americans. Racism is based on a flawed conception of race as a biological, inherent identity, when in fact it is a social construction. This is stated by Margaret Hunter. I think that the earliest sign of colorism in my lifetime, as far as television depiction, was viewing On Viv, also known as Janet Hubert, being replaced. Of course, I know that colorism and racism existed before me, and unfortunately, it may exist after me. Yet, I remember being a child and being kind of wooed by the unveiling, dark skinned beauty who was disciplined, profound, and feminine. And then I remember she was replaced, like she didn't exist, and that bothered me. But I really didn't understand why it was so important at that time, again, because I was so young. And I think a lot of onlookers or fans felt the same way. Of course, some were very upset, and others just wondered. This is a big difference of who these women are. And though a lot of people didn't want to take it out on the quote unquote new skin Viv, we noticed that she wasn't as talented, to be honest, as an actress. Because of colorism existing, some people are allowed to be mediocre in a lot of spaces. And so I'm not saying this to really go in on quote unquote light skinned people. I just wanted today to talk about just the colorism in the 90s and why there were a lot of dark skinned people who had to be like very multi talented, although they were still scrutinized and stereotyped. But let me explain colorism a little more before we get into all that. There is an existing beauty standard characterized by skin complexion among African Americans that erodes the framework of cultural identity, inclusion, mobility, and social acceptance. This phenomenon has plagued the African American community since the period of slavery, and it continues to hold weight on today's society. It is well established that American society does have an intricate history in regards to race relations, an equally important matter that has not gained significant attention. The main characteristic that continues to separate the dominant groups from the non-dominant groups is skin color. Moreover, it is apparent that colorist ideology is based on not just skin pigmentation, but also highly correlated physical traits, such as hair texture, eye color, and facial features. In addition to the macro societal influences, colorism is also imparted at the micro level as one's family shapes a person's identity, their perspectives, and life experiences, and materializing within the socialization process. As stated by Skin Complexion in the 21st Century, the impact of colorism on African American women. So I say all that to get into my main points of today, which will be again about character depiction, the struggles of the characters, and how they were mocked on television, and overall desirability. At first, I was going to focus on the 90s, but I feel like why not just put the 90s and the 2000s together? So my first example, I'm going to talk about the television show Martin. Pam was this woman who had a career. She was very beautiful, and she just happened to be, I guess, what some would call slim thick. She could wear like literally anything and make it look good. And she had this like overall confidence. At times she was a comedic relief. And often, unfortunately, it was at her own expense. And I think that Pam happens to be like overall an upbeat person, but at times I felt like she was depicted as the angry black woman, especially when she would like stand up for herself. There was also this underlying joke that Pam couldn't keep a man. And in comparison to Gina, it just seemed like she wasn't desirable and that she wasn't feminine. And I say that because not only was Gina light skinned, but Gina was kind of the opposite of Pam in a sense where she was in a long-term monogamous relationship. Although some people would argue that Martin wasn't the best boyfriend or fiance, Gina also was a bit more soft-spoken. Yeah, there were times where she would stand up to Martin, but overall she could pout and get her way. And she was just usually deemed as like more classy to a lot of people. Even when people do like remakes of Gina, or when they talk about Gina and Martin's relationship, they say, oh, I want a classy girl like Gina. But I think a lot of people argue that Gina was a cool person, but Pam was a total package. Again, Pam used to speak up for herself. She was funny, she was beautiful, and she was just a down to earth person. And it's not like Gina, again, wasn't grand in the scheme of things, but to me, she was kind of presented as a trophy wife, or just like a trophy in general compared to Pam, who was dark skinned. And a lot of times in the like 90s and 2000s, I don't know if it's today, y'all let me know, but it seemed like there was always like a best friend who was light skinned, dark skinned. And I feel like with Gina and Pam, it was like that. Even when it came to Martin being dark skinned compared to Gina, it's like that was always paired together. So let me get back to how Pam was criticized. Pam was often criticized because of her looks. She was told that she looked manly. And one of the biggest things that Martin used to call her throughout the show was Beady Bead, which focused on the fact that not only did she wear weave, but just focusing on the texture of her hair, particularly her edges. I just thought it was kind of ironic at the time that men acknowledged after the airing of the show how they did see Pam as more beautiful or the total package, but a lot of the men used to laugh at those jokes. And so these type of instances also remind me how black men, whether consciously or subconsciously, can perpetuate colorism as well. And I know this is a television show, but even in society, there's a lot of black men who say, oh, I love me a dark skinned woman. The blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, blase, blase. But when a lot of colorist comments are made towards darker skinned women, these same men don't often interject or speak up for these women. I'm also going to add on Shanae in the mix. So Shanae was played by Martin, and she was like the stereotypical loud ghetto neighbor, just to be frank. Shanae was like always in someone's business, always willing to fight. Oftentimes, Pam would get fed up and be willing to fight Shanae, and Gina would be the voice of reason. Again, I think this plays into the character trope of like lighter skinned people being more reasonable or passive and darker skinned people being aggressive. But Martin Lawrence didn't just stop with depicting Shanae's ghetto. He also depicted his own mother as someone who was overbearing and just a negative, intrusive person. And so I think that Martin even being willing to embody a black woman and depict this type of manner just perpetuated colorism, even though he was a black man. Next up, I'm going to talk about the television show Girlfriends. So Girlfriends came out in like the early 2000s, and I noticed on the show there were like two biracial women, Joan and Lynn, and then there were like two black women, Tony and Maya. Of course, Tony and Maya had their life were like drastically different in a sense. They also had some similarities. So first I'm going to talk more about Maya. Maya was someone who was married to a black man, and she had a job as Joan's secretary. She seems to always have like some type of financial or family trouble or some type of drama going on. And it often seemed like she wasn't doing her job in the show. And there are times where that type of trope is kind of like funny or interesting. But I just thought it was interesting how Maya happened to be darker skinned and she didn't have her life together. And Joan seemed to have like a level of privilege as her boss, as a successful attorney. Even though Joan's life wasn't like grand in the scheme of things, I guess you could say level of opportunities presented itself, or just how the characters were depicted kind of stood out to me. There were times that Maya's like family life or like her husband, it seemed like he was struggling with work or struggling with something. The family in this friendship happened to be black and happened to be the darker skinned character who was Maya. And though unfortunately she was relatable in a sense, I thought it was interesting they chose who had that type of depiction. Tony Childs was kind of different in a sense. I guess you could say, bougie black girl. And she, what some people would consider hypergamy to this day. Not to say that it didn't exist then, but you hear a lot of conversations about hypergamy and leveling up. Tony Childs was someone who refused to be poor. She talked about how she grew up in the countryside of California, and oftentimes she wasn't very close to her family. There were times her mother would show up and I guess humble her in a way. Her mom happened to be Jennifer Lewis, and she was really loud and outspoken. And oftentimes Tony would kind of like, I don't want to say belittle herself, but she would become very humble when her mother was present. Tony Childs, throughout the show, she portrayed to me a lot of internalized colorism and anti-blackness. There was an episode where Tony Childs said that she refused to date a darker skinned man because she had always been told she was darker skinned and she didn't want to procreate and have a dark skinned child. I think it was kind of evident too on how she ended up marrying a doctor who was a white man, and she didn't really even vet him. It was just his whiteness, in a sense, and him being a doctor that I feel like made him attractive to her. And ironically, after she kind of got committed to him, she realized that he was broke. I think that was a lesson not only about how bias can skew your judgment. In general, it kind of talked about just self-love in a sense too, because you have to heal yourself before you can have a healthy relationship or any type of stable relationship. Other things that Tony did was like call Maya's child Jabobo or some type of like weird name that wasn't his name. His name was Jabari. And I feel like because he had, I guess you could say, an Afrocentric name, that she would play at it or nitpick at it. And I know in the totality, you have like aunties and stuff who might joke with someone, but like not pronouncing a child's name correctly because it was seemingly black, to me was just a very anti-black sentiment. Though discrepancies between light and dark complexions speak generally to categorizations of race, colorism is a specific phenomenon of stratification that has been formed within the African American community. Among African Americans, there exists an arrangement of skin tones with varying degrees from light to dark. Some shades are considered more acceptable than others. Historical research indicates that African Americans with lighter skin tones have fewer societal barriers, not only in white America or interracially, but also among African Americans themselves. This intraracial discrimination is termed, again, colorism, coined by Alice Walker in 1982. In essence, color hierarchies have established negative evaluations of darker complexions that influence perceptions both personally and institutionally. All the associations of skin complexions affect both women and men of African descent. It has been thoroughly suggested that these biases lead to greater harm for African American women. What about when there are exceptions? Ironically, there are times where colorism doesn't impact all characters.